moving then. All right, welcome back. We are COMP397, that's web game programming in the winter 2022 semester at Centennial, and it's week 4, part 2 of our broadcast. And for this one, we're just going to go back into Unity. So what did we do so far? Things that we could do, we downloaded a reasonable reference for the column or the archway we wanted to build. We built a simple archway in Blender. We added a marble texture and we used Smart UV Project to get those islands. We exported the model to FBX. And then what we're going to do now is we're going to import the archway. We actually already did this piece. And we're going to build a mini-map. And this is the way we're going to do it, right? So one thing we're going to do is not do Cinemachine right now. I'm going to kind of take this piece, this kind of requirement out. Build to WebGL, I'm going to move to next week because, like I said, we just won't have time. But we're going to do this piece right here, okay? Let's do it and see how it goes. So back into Unity. Let's bring that into Unity. What I've done also up on eCentennial is I've added a couple of new assets. The enemy marker, the player marker, and the Minimap Mask. Please download those 3 assets. Enemy marker, player marker, Minimap Mask. And these are sprites more than anything else, or textures. They're actually textures. So we can put them in the textures folder. So that's what I'm going to do. So here in the textures folder, we have these, and I'm also going to add in these other things that I just gave you. So I'm going to grab the player marker. It looks just like what you're seeing. The enemy marker, there's the player marker, enemy marker, the Minimap Mask, which is just a circle, right? There we go. And those are the things we did last semester. We made those things and made them from scratch. So you should have a couple of these things to go. One thing to note is that this one and this one, those 2 things, and even this one, all these 3 things, they are, when it comes to what we want them to be, the texture type is a default, and it's what we want is sprite, 2D, and UI. This is what we want to go with. Okay, sprite, 2D, and UI, and it's pretty important to do it this way because otherwise we'll have a weird texture that has, you know, kind of a background. All right, so please make sure you copy these 3 things or change them to sprite, sprite, 2D, and UI. Let's also make another folder, subfolder, in the textures, which we'll call sprites, because that's what these things are. So I'll grab player marker, Minimap Mask, and enemy marker and drop them in there. And no, I didn't mean to do that, but okay. Thank you for opening up my enemy marker in Fireworks computer. I want to grab all this and just drag and drop it into there. So we can organize ourselves in sprites. So I got these 3 sprites in the sprites folder, which are inside the textures folder. Yeah, so I have just that. Just an organizational thing perspective. Okay, now that I have enemy marker, mini mask, and player marker, I need to add a material, and I'm going to add it inside of materials. It's going to be a special type of material. Let's go back to textures first. I'm going to add a new texture. There we go. And it's going to be called a render texture. Let's do that first. Render texture. All right, and the render texture, I'm going to call this the Minimap render texture. There we go. So a render texture is a special type of texture that we can target, as an example. That's what we can do. So we need the Minimap render texture. That's what we need. And I need a Minimap material now too. So let's add a new Minimap material and we'll make it point to the Minimap render texture. But for now, let's add a raw image to the screen, to our main scene. So again, I'm going to go to UI and I'm going to go to raw image. And when I go to raw image, it's pretty massive, right? Where it gets added in. And what this looks like is actually like an image that looks like this on the screen, right? So pretty, kind of weird where it is right now, right? And remember, because we have the player canvas is, the main camera is in the player. One thing that we want to do for our canvas, when we added a raw image, a canvas was created. We don't want to do a screen space overlay, but rather what we want to do instead is a screen space camera. And we want to target the player's camera. So take the player main camera and drag it in there. And the reason why we want to do that is because the main camera is floating around with the player. So that's something that's going to happen. So if I go back to the player, let's go back to the player. And just what I'm going to do is I'm going to just focus on the player for a second. Then what I want is for the screen space overlay for my canvas. This is what the canvas is going to see, right? So this is that image. Now it's going to float around with the player. So if I was to play the game for a second, just to give you a sense, here's that. I just put an image in a rough spot. Then notice that it's going to hang out with me. And it's also going to be behind everything right now. We're going to change that because that doesn't make any sense, right? So let's look at order and layer, right? Order and layer is kind of important. It looks like it's 0, but we want this canvas to be like way higher. So let's make it like 100. And if I was to do that and go, right? So let's try it out now. Now you should see that still it's appearing below everything else. All right, it's just pointing it out there to you so you can see that. So that is the order and layer. So that's a problem for us. Okay, that's an issue. And why is that happening? Well, the main camera right now has a depth of 1, a -1, and that's okay, right? But what we want to do is we need another camera to target this thing. That's the Minimap camera that we talked about before. Minimap camera is going to be separate, and it's going to target this raw image, right? So again, if I go back to raw image, notice it has 2 things, right? It doesn't have a material. This is the Minimap material, so let's add that in next. Let's make it work first, then we'll talk about how to do it. So create a new material called the Minimap material, Minimap material. Okay, don't worry about this right now. And if I take that Minimap material, right, and if I go back to the raw image and I drag it in there, right, well, it's just going to give me this image right here, right? So that's kind of something that's happening. So that's raw image, right? And what I really want is a render texture, right? That's what I want. I want a kind of a place where I'm going to render. So what's the difference between a raw image, and let's just comment this out for a second, and add in a UI image. So here's the difference in an image and a regular. So both are the same. One is a little different. It allows it to be maskable, just like the raw image. Raw image and regular image are very similar, okay, in terms of the component, okay. And again, if I was to target so notice it says source image for the image and material, but there's no texture, whereas raw image has a texture that we can kind of target, right? All right, so let's go back to delete this, go back to raw image, undo this, and we may not need the Minimap material for now. I just want to show you that if I put the material in there, what it does. Okay, so put by material for now. Okay, Minimap material's gone. But the texture, the raw image, if I put that back in, and if I, kind of, let's just go none. If I target the texture, which is the Minimap render texture here, that is what's being targeted, the Minimap render texture, right? All right, cool. I like it. Now, how do I bind the material? That's the material that's going to be looking at. So this is the Minimap render texture is where the Minimap is going to come in. That's where it's going to come in. And the raw image is going to be drawn on the screen wherever I want it. So now if I want to reposition it, this is just like last time. Select last time. I want to reposition it so it's at the top right corner of the screen over here. As an example, that's where the material is going to come into play, on the top right corner of the screen. So that's something that I could do. And by the way, if I was to go back to the canvas and make it, if I took this back to screen space overlay for 1 sec, just so that we can see it here in the player. If I was to play the game right now, right, then there should be no difference. You can't see the minimap because it's hidden. Let's put a new camera into place. So I'm going to add a new camera. So camera. And what I want to do with this camera, right, as an example, instead of having a skybox, let's make it solid color. Right, this is the second camera. And we'll call this the Minimap Cam. Minimap Camera. There it is. And we'll put it underneath the directional light so we can see what it is right now. There's a Minimap Camera. And all I want to do for now is I want to change it from perspective to orthographic. But what I want to do is let's just reset the camera to where it is. You can see what it's looking at right now. Right? And if I was to look at the camera in the scene, it's right here. Right? So this is where the minimap is. So the camera is right there. So what I want to do is I want to lift up the camera so it kind of rises above the scene, and I want to rotate it right across the x-axis. So across the x-axis, let's go to like 90 degrees. So you can see that it looks down at the tiles. Let's move it like a little bit up. Okay, so it kind of looks like this. There we go. So that's the tiles. And what we want to do is we want to change it from perspective to orthographic, right? But we want to give it a space of like something like 20. Okay, so that's kind of the mini map. And we could probably organize it so it follows the player. So it's like centered on the player themselves. So for now, because we don't have a very good view, it doesn't matter how close we bring it now because it's an orthographic view, right? So this is the mini map, right? It doesn't really matter how close we bring it in. But the one thing we don't want, as an example, is this long map. See how long it's like the far plane. The near plane is like kind of the plane that's nearest the player's eyes, if you will, or the camera's eyes. And the far plane is how far we can see. But this makes it too far. Let's make it so it's like, let's say 100. And that even is too much, but it's okay. At least it's not as computationally expensive to manage, right? So that's the entire map. Notice that doesn't matter how far I pull it off, you're only going to see what you're going to see. The one thing that does make a difference is the positioning of the map, something that looks like this. Okay. And what we should see in the game is that the game should render the Minimap camera, instead of just seeing the top down, it should render into a target texture. So this is the target texture. So we're going to take that Minimap render texture and use that as the target texture. There it is. Look at that. So at the top right corner of the screen, we're going to have the minimap. Let's make it something bigger than this. So in our raw image, we're going to make it so that this size, the width and height, is like 250. So something that's reasonable. And we're going to bring this in a little closer. So just like we've done in the past, I'm going to go to the scene and go to the canvas for a second and just go into 2D mode. So I see where the canvas is. And I'm just going to bring this canvas in by grabbing the raw image and bringing it down to where it's going to be. Something like that. And if I was to run the game now, right, just to run the game, you're going to see that there's that mini map, and I can see things moving on it. And those are the enemies. And you're going to see that it goes by that archway, and then eventually here they are. But they're pretty ugly. So we're going to start with this first. So what I want to do now is on the enemy objects, so the robots. Let's pick that the first robot themselves, and let's go back into 3D mode. I want to put in that enemy marker on a quad. All right, that's what I want to do. So I want to add a quad to the robot. So on the robot, I'm going to say 3D object. So I'm clicking on the robot to do this. 3D object. I want to make a quad, right? And here's the quad. Okay, and let's look at it from where it's supposed to be looked at right now. So over here. And what I want to do with the quad is I want a material on there like we talked about. And the material is going to be because right now we have a default material. We're going to call this the Minimap marker material. So in the material, maybe just call it the marker material. So material, we'll call this the marker material. Here it is, marker material. And what I want to do is, so standard is one thing, right? So I can do that. What if I made it something like UI Unlit? UI Unlit transparent, which is what I want, okay? UI Unlit transparent. Let's try that first. And I want to grab that sprite, which is the enemy marker, and drag it in there. There it is. So that's what I want to do, right? And I want to take that quad, which is this, we'll call this the minimap marker or the enemy marker. There it is. And I want to apply that material to it. So again, going back to material, I can grab that marker material and drag it in. And now you can see we have a marker, but it's like on top of the robot's head. We want to rotate it across the x-axis. So again, grabbing that enemy marker. And if we rotate it across the x-axis, you can clearly see that we want to go to like 90 degrees. Okay. Let's make a new layer. We'll call it the marker layer. We've done this all before, by the way, guys. People who were with me last semester. For the people who are not with me, it's pretty much the same thing. Here's the enemy marker. We want to select the marker layer, right? And what I want is, I don't want the robot. Let's make another layer for the robot. So I'm going to say a new layer. We'll call this the enemy layer. And we'll go to the robot themselves, and we will assign on the robot that layer. And it says change all the children. Yeah, okay, but I'll change the enemy marker back in a second. So yes, but then let's change this back to marker. There we go. So now I have the marker, that's the robot, and then the robot itself. And what I can do is, for the main camera, I don't want to see the marker. So when it comes to the culling mask, we can choose the marker's not there, but the enemy is there. We want to be able to see enemies, just not the marker, right? We've done this before. But for the Minimap camera, it's the other way around. We don't want to see enemies, but we do want to see the marker, okay? We do want to see the marker and the ground. So now you can see what it looks like in the example, but it's a little bit small. So example, inside the game, you can see it's kind of small to see the enemy marker, right? So what we can do instead of the enemy marker is make it bigger, make that quad, which is the enemy marker. Let's make that twice as big. So scale it up. Again, you won't be able to see it except, on the minimap. So again, if I go to the game, you can see now that's pretty big. That's where the enemy is, and it actually points in the direction that enemy's looking. Right, so there it is. And I want to not see it in the game eventually too. For now, what I want to do is want to take this robot and I want to override, the enemy marker and the robot body and all that stuff, right? So I'm going to say apply all. So that means the other robot is also going to have an enemy marker as well. And if I look at the enemy robot, there it is. So it's pretty good. There's the enemy marker. Yeah. So if I play the game now, just the way it is, without not a lot of changes, you can see now that the markers will change and they'll move around the scene until they see me. We don't know where I am because I don't have a marker. Let's put mine in too for the player. So going back to the player marker, let's do the same thing. So I'm going to add, right click. I'm going to add in actually, just to be even better, let's just do this. Let's just copy the enemy marker. So Control D, drag that enemy marker on top of the player, right? There it is. And what I can do with the enemy marker is call this the player marker. Player marker. Let's reset the position. So the position will be 0, 0, 0. So for now, it'll be in the middle of the player object. And if I go to the player by clicking on the player and clicking frame select mode, right, you can see that clearly there's the player. And we don't want the red marker. We want to give the other marker there. So we'll move this up. Oops, undo. Move the player marker to the top of the player's head. And again, from the player perspective, it has to be higher up than the player. Something that looks like this. So let's say the player marker will be slightly lower. There's the player marker, but it's got red on it, and it's looking in the right direction because that's the way the player is going. So we've saved a couple of steps to do that. But the player marker is just this marker material. Let's call this the player marker material because the player marker material is going to have a different object on it. So we have marker material. Let's just duplicate that. Control D. Call this player marker material. Player marker material. And we'll just rename the other one to enemy marker material. We're halfway there, guys. There it is. Player marker material is not going to have that texture, but rather it's going to have the green texture. I'm going to change that up. And we can change the player marker material right now so that it uses the right material. So going to the material, change the material type to the player marker material as well. And it's got a marker and everything else, but we don't want to see the player. We don't see the player because they're invisible, but let's make sure the player is tagged. So the player is tagged as a player. So just in case, the Minimap Camera will also not see the player. So just in case I have something on the player, that we won't see the player anymore. So now when I run it, you should see that we should see the player and the minimap where I'm looking. So does this make sense? Yes. So I can kind of move around there, and you can see that these guys are going to come after me, and I can kind of get a sense of where to go by looking at the Minimap Camera, and I can see that they're totally going to force me out. All right, so that's kind of the way it works generally, but I think that the Minimap is pretty big, and wouldn't it be nice if it was a little bit smaller? Well, you can add a duplicate to this, right? And we've done this before. So again, this is just review for those people that have done it with me. In the UI, so in the canvas where we have the raw image, this is actually the Minimap image itself, right? That's what it is. So this is the Minimap image, Minimap image, right? And what we want to do is duplicate this thing. So Control D, right? And the other image, it's exactly the same. It's overlaid on top of this one now, but we can give it a background and a different texture. And we can change it from a raw image to something else, right? So we want to make this the Minimap Mask. This is the Minimap Mask. So we're going to call it. And what we can do is we can add in a mask component. Mask. Right, there it is, Minimap Mask, right? And for the texture, we can use that other texture I got for you guys, which is going to be the Minimap Mask texture, this one. And so you can see what it does, right? So it makes a little circle. And what I can do is I can take the Minimap image and put it inside of the Minimap Mask, right? But before we do that, let's copy the Minimap Mask one more time. So Control D, and we'll make this the Minimap Border, just to make it really quick. And we'll take away the mask. So goodbye mask. Remove that from that one. There we go. So the border doesn't have a mask. It's got this image. And we'll make it that eventually we'll size everything. So if I want the border to be 250, then I want the Minimap Mask to be slightly smaller. And so what I'm going to do first is do this. I'm going to say, grab the image, put it inside the mask, right? Let's just hide the border for now, so we don't need it. Now you're going to see that the Minimap Mask looks like this. Minimap thing, right? So this is the actual Minimap itself. We may want to change the size of our camera. So the camera itself, notice what it does is it's a 20 size, but we can't see the player right now because the player is not centered on this thing, right? So we want to match the X and Y coordinates of wherever the player is. We don't really care about the Z coordinates right now, or actually it's going to be the X and Z coordinates of the player. So the Minimap it's going to follow the player really kind of easily right now. It's going to be one-to-one for the player. So let's make a new script. So create C# script. And the C# script is going to be called the Minimap follow script. And we're going to attach it to the Minimap Camera. going to attach it to the Minimap camera one day. Come on. Yeah, it happens sometimes. Let's try that again. Let's delete that Minimap follow and make it again. It's because I'm too fast, guys. Let's try it again. So create new C# script Minimap. We'll call it controller. How about that? Just keep it the same. Minimap controller. Give it a sec. Let it do this. Yay. Awesome. And then go to the Minimap camera and then pull in the Minimap controller on top of that. Yay. Awesome. And let's, we're going to say it's going to be over the player. So for now, let's position the camera so it is over the player so we get a sense of what it looks like. So let's position the camera so it's the same X and Z coordinates as the player. So the player's coordinates right now are -769, and we'll put that inside the Minimap camera. And the player's coordinates for the Z is this. So I'm just copying in so we can have the exact coordinates. And so you can see what the Minimap would see. You get this white area. And in the game, you can see this area that's white, right? And that's okay if you wanted to make this white. We can make it black as well. We might decide to make it black because of this size, the way it looks right now. But this is what I want. And when I kind of double click on the Minimap controller, I want to say that wherever the player is where on the X and Z axis is where I want the Minimap to be. For now, it's going to be like a direct line before we add in the Cinemachine. So again, what I want to expose, or I want to get access to a public transform that I'm going to call player, okay? And all I'm going to say is wherever that player is, that every frame, I'm going to say that transform.position is going to be equal to the player. So a new, sorry guys, I know I'm running over time, new vector3 object that is going to be the player.transform. Sorry, it's just ReSharper is taking its time. Player.position. Come on ReSharper. Player.position.x and the player.position.z, but we don't care about the player.position.y. The y is always going to be the same as it is right now for the Minimap. The Minimap is at, let's say, 33. So that's not going to change. It's not going to change that at all. Let's leave it at 33.0f, just to, you know, have a number right now. And then we'll replace this with Cinemachine later on. All right, so this is what's going to happen there. We don't need the start method because we're just getting a reference to the player right now because it's our first version. And what I want to do is we need to get a reference to the player. So let's get the player object and go in there. And let's just, for now, because we haven't made the player a prefab and there's a lot of stuff in there, I don't want to lose it. So let's drag and drop the player into the prefabs folder to make a prefab with that. And that's pretty good, right? And the great thing about this now is that we should have the piece parts that I want. So if I play the game, let's just run the game the way it is. If I play the game, then you can see that the player, it's always going to be centered around the player. Doesn't look quite right yet, but at least I can, you know, kind of see the map as well as everything else. Okay, so pretty cool. One thing that I don't want to do is I don't like this white area. So again, for the Minimap Mask, right, where I made it white, we can tint it so it is whatever color you want. Let's make it black as a good example so it doesn't distract. And then I can make the outside white if I want to as a Minimap border. So the border, let's first of all make that Minimap mask slightly smaller. Let's say something like 230 by 230, right? So something like that. So a little bit smaller than what it was, 230 by 230. Let's activate the Minimap border, right? So activate it again. And let's put the Minimap masks inside of the Minimap border, like so. And now you're going to have this as one Minimap itself. This is the Minimap. All right, so if I run it now, we're going to have that Minimap and it's going to look pretty good. So we can run away. We can try and scoot out of there. We're never going to make it. Oh, I jumped over them somehow. I don't know how I did that. But you can see now that they're chasing me, and they're going to try and find me. But you can see that I'm going to try and avoid the enemies. I'm going to run myself into a thing here. But you can totally, oh yeah, I'm done. This is such a small, what am I call it, murder box in here. It's pretty crazy. All right, so that's pretty good, right? The Minimap is working, and let's just save. File, save project, and let's exit. And any questions around anything that you've seen so far in terms of Minimap? Again, it was a little fast, I know that, but this is again a review for those who had it last semester, for those who had it this semester. For the first time, I will go through it in one more second, and then we'll be done for the day. Added Minimap. Okay, so commit all changes and push. And let's go back into Unity one last time, and then we'll be done for the day. Sorry for going over, guys. Sorry, Joshua. 1 second. So piece parts that we needed we needed the markers. Okay, so that's the first thing. So if we go to the textures, we needed the markers and sprites. I had to convert them to Sprite 2D and UI, all of them, each one. Okay. In the materials, this is required. I needed the enemy marker material, which is again a UI unlit transparent material type. That's the shader. And I dragged and dropped the sprite, the red sprite, into there. That's the thing I did. I did the exact same thing with the player marker material, but I had the green sprite in there. That's all the difference was there for the player material. In the textures, I also needed to create a Minimap render texture. The render texture is a target for a camera. Cameras can display on the screen, but they can also display on a part of the screen through the use of a texture, a render texture. A render texture describes an area where the camera is going to display what it sees, quote unquote. That's what it does. So that's what we needed, a Minimap render texture. Those are the pieces we need. Inside of the scene now, when it looks at the scene itself, we created the first thing we did was we created a raw image, right? And we attached the texture, the Minimap render texture, to it. Okay, that's where it's going to show. Okay, and we created a new camera, and the camera is a Minimap camera. We changed the type from a perspective to an orthographic camera, and I put it out around 20 units or meters away from from the target. I rotated the camera 90 degrees, so it kind of looks down at the scene. So again, if I was to look at the camera itself, you can see that the camera looks down at the scene. And for now, I put it over, just to start, I put it over the player's head. That's what it is. But instead of the render path, the target, normally when you make a camera, take a look at this camera here for the player. For the main camera, you don't have a render texture assigned to it. All right. By default, cameras don't have this, but the Minimap camera, I dragged and dropped the Minimap render texture in there to let it know that this is where I want you to display the things that you can quote unquote see. That's what it works. Then you actually you should be able to see what the Minimap texture is inside of the canvas. The canvas we put on screen space overlay, but we could put it on the player. I showed you what the problem is with putting it on in the camera. It layers it so it's behind everything, which is not great right now. Okay, eventually we'll change that. But that's screen space overlay. All right, that's where the canvas is. And the first thing we had was this Minimap image, right? Now what I did was I made a copy of the Minimap image. So I Control D, make a copy of it, and I called it the Minimap Mask, and it's separate first, right? The Minimap Mask, I added a mask component, right? And what the mask component does is whatever the texture is, right, it will mask or block out anything outside of the texture. So example, that's why it appears in the game to be a circle, because anything outside of that area is going to be blocked out or not drawn. It's going to be basically not rendered outside of the mask. So the mask defines an area where only where the texture is going to be drawn. Anything outside of that and these checkered pattern or the transparencies, it's not going to be drawn at all. So that's how that works. Okay. And then what I did was I can take the Minimap image and put it inside of the Minimap mask as a child, and then it would mask the image because of the Minimap mask. You can change the color of the mask to whatever you want, right? Red or whatever. That's just the color of the texture that I assigned to it, right? That shape. And by the way, if I wanted to make the Minimap a hexagon, I just have to make a shape to put in here that's a hexagon instead of a circle. I just use a circle in this case, okay? So I made it black. That's what I did, the background. And then before I did that, I made a copy of the Minimap mask and called it Minimap Border, right? Knowing that I was going to shrink the mask a little bit smaller, and the border would stick out behind it. It's the same size, the same exact image is behind it. Look at that Minimap mask image, but it's bigger. It's 250 by 250 units compared to 230 by 230, so that the Minimap mask fits inside of it. That's the effect, and I can make it bigger or smaller. If I didn't want to make the border that big, I can make it so that it's smaller and size this one up if I really wanted to. All right, so that's how that whole layering thing works. Then it came time to make the components for the player. The player marker itself had to be a quad, because the player marker, for a sprite to render in 3D, it has to have a surface to render, right? And that's a key learning as well from us, because, for example, if I wanted to draw a sprite like an image, tattoo, or some kind of decal on part of the game world, as an example, then I would want to use some kind of target, like a quad like this. And what the quad does, right, is it allows me to cast, because the quad has a material, right? I can use the material to target the quad as where I want to draw my texture. Remember that the player marker material is actually a UI unlit transparent shader, right? That allows me to, it doesn't need any light, so light doesn't affect it. That's what unlit means. And transparent means it'll respect the transparencies of the sprites that are cast on it, right? Which means when I say cast, dragged and dropped into this texture area. Okay, that's what this is. So that's how the UI unlit transparent shader works. And I apply that to the quad. I just renamed the quad to player marker. Quad is just, but don't be afraid of the word. It's literally just a small plane. That's what it is. That's what a quad is. Small plane. And basically that quad is where this thing is. I've just moved it up. I've changed the layer. I made a new layer called marker. And what you can do with cameras is you can have the camera ignore certain layers when it comes to what it quote unquote sees. So for example, the Minimap camera doesn't include the enemy or the player, but does include the marker. Whereas the player camera, right, does not include the marker, but does include the enemy and the player and the ground, as an example, right? Well, it doesn't include the player because the player doesn't have a body right now. And the other thing is that's really annoying, this is the last thing we'll do, is that we can actually see the marker in real and all the time now on top of the player and the enemy. We don't want to see this marker. And you can actually go into here in the editor and you can turn off those layers as well. So you can say, I don't want to see the marker layer ever. And now in the editor, I don't need to see the marker. And that's the lesson for today. So let's save that file, save project, and let's talk about what you need to put up on GitHub for today, right? And for your lab 4. Again, the lab report will be out later on, but hopefully, Joshua, that was a little slower to get you to understand what I did, and so to explain how it works. But for lab 4, here are the requirements at a high level. Again, I'll have all the detailed requirements in a lab report very shortly, as soon as I'm done this video. So again, download a reasonable reference. We did that. Build a simple archway in Blender. We did that. Texture and UV unwrap. We use a smart UV project. We did that. We exported it to FBX. In the Unity side, we imported the archway from Blender from the Blender FBX. We did that. How to create a minimap. We did the minimap, right? So this is kind of example of just steps that we needed. We followed these steps. We didn't do these pieces, and they're not going to be included in the lab. Only this part right here. So this is the Unity half, and not including the Blender FBX, file. So that's it. Is if you followed along and did these things, made a minimap and made an arch, you're good to go. Okay. Any questions before we go for the day? And I'll stick around for those people who need me for other reasons. Okay, let me stop recording now. And I know that was fast, guys. Thank you for your patience. And I'll see you guys next week. Good luck on this week. Hopefully you'll have a chance to get together with your team for those people who are non-gaming students and start building the next part of your project. Yes, I will. Hold on a second. All right, so we're not recording on YouTube anymore, and I'm just going to close